All right, so I promised you that I'm going to make this applicable to you. I will. At first glance, though, you look at this and you say, what's going on? This whole king business, anointing, we don't do this anymore. I gave you some of the context. I said, listen, Saul had been king, and he messed up. And the Lord says, Saul, you're out. I'm going to find a new one. And you must know this, the way in which God chooses this king, it's radical, it's life-changing, it's earth-shattering, it's countercultural, and it's grace-filled. And when you start to see the way that God chooses this king, it'll affect the way that you know how God chooses you. And then it'll consequently change the way you choose others in your life. What do I mean by that? I'll explain. Let me put it this way, and you can follow along in your outlines. Samuel, the Lord says, Samuel, go to Bethlehem, this little tiny backwater town. And there you're going to find the new king, the one who's going to rise up, my chosen one. Saul messed it up. He's out. We get to start over again. Clean slate. Go. And Samuel, he's the high priest. And so he thinks he surely knows what kind of king God's looking for. He goes to the house of Jesse. And God says, when one of Jesse's kids is going to be king, but who it is a shock to everyone. And it should be a shock to you and me today once we see what God's really doing in this passage. Let me explain it this way, and I put it under your outline, I think under the headings. At first, we see the people's king, or rather, who they would want to be king, who looks the part, who has the good optics, who everybody would have said, he's the man. Samuel even says it 7 times. And every time they bring up another son, they're wrong, because that's the people's king. God says, I'm going to give you a new type of king. And he's going to be unlike anything you ever could have imagined. And once you start to see this, you'll start to see the pattern that we've been building on each week, the way in which God works. It started with Hannah. Remember, barren. She was the barren wife. She would have been the failure of a wife. Yet God works through her. Then he continues on, and Eli was the high priest. He's the venerated, older one, well-respected. And God chooses little Sammy in the corner, sleeping next to the ark, and says, he's going to be my high priest. And when he picks Saul, even Saul, who grows to be, sort of megalomaniacal, when he picks Saul, where's Saul? Saul's hiding in the luggage. He's a scared little scrawny runt of a dude. And God says, I pick him. But today God one-ups even himself. Let me explain. First, the people. The people's king. Who would they have wanted? Well, you see this. Samuel walks in the room. And he looks at Eliab, who's the oldest son. And he says, surely that's the one. That's the one. He's the oldest, primogeniture. The oldest by rights. Had the rights to everything. He was the man. He was the one who was going to take over the inheritance and the lineage in the name of the Father. And it even says this. It says that he had stature. It means that he looked the part. Everybody would have looked at Eliab and said, he's the man. He's sleek, good looking. But more important than that, the word here that he uses for appearance, and he contrasts it with David later on in appearance, I'll explain that, is a little confusing. But actually in Hebrew, the word for appearance here, he says, is countenance. He says when Eliab walked in the room, everybody would have turned their heads and said, he's the guy. I want to have dinner with him. I want him to like me on Facebook. I want him to be my friend, my partner, go to coffee with him. That's the man. Even Samuel, the high priest, he's the man in the know. And he's wrong. He's dead wrong. And each time they bring one of Jesse's sons, one after the other, and there's 7, and it's important that you know that number. I'll explain why in a moment. And every time that the proper candidate comes up, God says, nope. And God has this little quip. He says to Samuel, people judge by what they see, but I see into the heart. I want you to pause here, and it depends which cultural background you come out of. And some of you come from a more Eastern cultural background, some from a more Western cultural background. Some of you may have respect for elders and the older ones in the family, and some of you may get this. Some of you may not. And somebody like me, a typical Westernized American, doesn't really get this. The oldest one was a slam dunk for the job. Eliab, it's him. Everybody in the neighborhood would have known it was him. Nobody thought about David, which is why he's out with the sheep. He ain't even invited to the party. Everyone would have known that Eliab had the optics. He looked the part. He was the part. He was the oldest. By rights, he had this in the bag. And God says, I'm going to do something very different than you ever could imagine. I'm going to show you what your kingdom truly needs. It doesn't need strength. It doesn't need appearance, God would say. It needs heart. And you and I, God says, by the very nature of being human, when we see people, we judge them by the externals, not the internals. God says, you see Eliab, and you think he should be the king. Why? Because he's the oldest? Because he's tall? Because he's handsome? You look at the outside. And listen, people, let's fast forward. Not much has changed. That God says, it's a truth, that's a universal truth. He says, listen to Samuel, and he's saying it to you and me this evening. When you and I see people, we see them for what they can bring us, what advantage they give us. We see them, do they look the part? Do they fit the mold? Then I want them. And the reason why I say this is because it's easy to rag on poor little Samuel and say, he's an idiot. Really? We do the same. Let's be honest. There's a little story, and I'm going to read this little bit of article, and it's about political candidates, not current ones, older ones. Please don't take it politically. There is no politics here tonight, no politics zone, okay? We're not doing that. I don't give this story to promote one person or the other. I give this story because it's an interesting case study of exactly what's going on here. Because the people are trying to get a king, and they want the king who looks polished, and they want the king who's oldest and has the stature and the recognition and the name brand. Not little David, but strong, mighty Eliab. Listen, 1960 in America. There's an article written, and goes like this, from Time magazine around that time, a little bit later actually. It says, at a time when the need for strong leadership in America was all too obvious, two vastly different candidates vied for the presidency. John F. Kennedy, a young but dynamic Massachusetts senator from a powerful New England family, and Richard Nixon, a seasoned lawmaker who is currently serving as vice president. I'm not promoting either one. Hold on. With little more than a single unremarkable term in the U.S. Senate under his belt, the 43-year-old Kennedy lacked Nixon's extensive foreign policy experience, and he had the disadvantage of being one of the first Catholics to run for president on a major party ticket. Nixon, it says, by contrast, had spent nearly 8 years as the country's second in command after an illustrious career in Congress. He became one of global communism's most outspoken critics, and he helped expose so on and so forth. And even at the young age of 39, it says the rivals campaigned tirelessly throughout that summer of 1960, with Nixon actually inching ahead in the polls to gain a slim lead. And most of you weren't alive at this time. You may not remember this, but Nixon was ahead. And what happened? They televised the debates. Ooh, it all went downhill. Why? Because people saw Nixon first standing next to Kennedy, and they saw Kennedy, young, handsome. He actually said that they had an orangish skin tone, looked like he had a suntan. It was actually from the medicine that he was taking for his back pains. But it said Nixon, on the other hand, had used this cheap makeup, and the stage lights had caused him to sweat, and I know how that feels. And the makeup had started running, and he looked clammy, and he looked sweaty. And everybody saw this around the nation. This was one of the first times that political commentators point out that optics started to matter, because Kennedy crushed him. There's actually a line where the Chicago mayor, Richard Daley, he's quoted as saying, "My God, they've embalmed Richard Nixon before he even died. He looked so bad on that stage." Listen, who do people want to run the kingdom? Politics aside, the sharp one, the slick one. And everybody knew it. There they stood on the stage, and everybody says, "I want him." So look, not much has changed. You see what they're doing now with Samuel and Eliab. Not much different. They want the tall guy, the strong one, the old one, with the name brand, the recognition. He's our king. And God says, I will have none of it. I don't see people the way you see them. I see them on the inside. And God says, I know what you need for your kingdom. You think you need strength and appearance and beauty for your kingdom, but you have no idea what true beauty is. It's not on the externals. It's on the internals. God says, you don't get the king you want. You get the king you need. And who is it? It's little Davy. Little Davy. Here's an interesting thing. Let me explain why the picking of David is so radical and countercultural and shocking. Maybe not to you this evening at 5:10 in the afternoon, but at this point, everybody would have laughed Samuel out of the building. Samuel says to Jesse, okay, all 7 of your kids, the perfect number, by the way, 7 boys. You don't get much better than that at that time. 7 is the number for perfection, and all the perfect little boys that come in front. And God says, nope, 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 nope. And he says, do you have another son? He says, do you have anybody else, Jesse? And Jesse actually says, yes, I have the youngest, but in Hebrew, you know what that means? He's actually saying, I have the smallest. He says, yes, I have one more. And he's the smallest. He's the runt of the litter. Look at this. He's not even invited to the selection show. If this is The Bachelor, and I don't watch the show, I hear about it. I don't watch the show. No. If this is The Bachelor and they're handing out roses, David's like out in the jacuzzi and nobody's even invited him into the rose ceremony. How do I know there's a rose ceremony? I read. I don't watch it. But listen, David's not even invited into the selection show. He's out with the sheep, which, by the way, when he gets to Goliath in a couple weeks, that's going to help him out a lot, that he was out there and they were in here. To pick David, the runt of the litter, the 8th one, the forgotten one, would have been shocking and embarrassing and stupid on the outside. And God says, go get him. He's going to be the one. He's going to be what you need. Listen, David is the ultimate Cinderella. Cinderella wasn't invited to the ball. David wasn't invited. And if you go back and you read that Cinderella story, and I'm talking about the Grimm's fairy tale one, not the like polished cartoons, although those are great and the movies are great. But if you go back to like the Grimm's fairy tale, it's kind of brutal. Do you remember that? Oh, it's poor Cinderella. You know why she's called Cinderella? Because she sleeps with the cinders and the ashes. And she's dirty and slovenly, and everybody's forgotten about her. And remember when the prince comes in all the cartoons and he comes to give her the shoe. He says, I have a shoe. I want to see who it fits. And the 2 sisters try it on. You know what that says in the fairy tale? The mother to the first daughter says, cut off your toes and you'll fit. She says, when you become queen, you don't need to walk anymore. And she fits, but then the prince sees that the toes are bleeding and he knows something's wrong. And he says, this is not the one. And so the stepmother says to the other daughter, she says, cut off your heel and then your shoes will fit. And she said, when you're queen, you won't need to walk anymore. I know it's grim, hence the name. No, that's not really why. But here's how the fairy tale goes. And in the real fairy tale, Cinderella's dad is still in the story. He hasn't gone away. And the prince says, listen, he's got 2 women with bloody feet. And he knows they're not the one. And he looks at the old man and he says, hey, do you have another one? And it's a sad line. This is her own fairy father. And he says, only my dead wife left behind her little stunted Cinderella. But it's impossible that she can be the bride. He says, the little stunted one, up in the attic, sleeping with the ashes. But she's the one. David, that's a nice story. It's a fairy tale. But David is the real Cinderella. He's the one nobody saw coming. And way of God is saying this. You order your life. And you make friendships and relationships primarily from what's on the outside. How that person benefits you. How that person makes you feel. What advantage you think you can gain with that person. That's what they wanted with Eliab. He's the strong one. And God says, to run your kingdom, you don't need the strong. You need the good of heart. You need the little ones. The humble guy. The shepherd from Bethlehem. It was absolutely foolish to choose David to be the king. He was the runt. Let me put it this way. If you have a kingdom, say you pretend you have a kingdom, Your kingdom is all about survival. You want to survive, right? It's your kingdom. It's about survival. It's a game of survival. You don't choose the runt to be the king. As a way to say this, if you've ever played dodgeball, I know some of you have. It's a good sport. You ever played dodgeball in school? What's the purpose of dodgeball? Dodge the ball. Catch the ball. Don't get hit by the ball. Now, I have a personal reflection on this story. Because when growing up, I was not the physical prowess that you see before you. I'm joking. When I grew up, I actually was affectionately termed melonhead growing up. I had a rather what you might call bulbous head. It was ratio-wise too big for my body. It's a wonder that I actually didn't topple over more often. I had these skinny little legs and knobby little knees and this big old head, and everybody called me melonhead or Q-tip or any other derivative you can. Now listen. I know, I'm putting myself out to laugh. That's fine. I don't care. It's my emotional scars bear for you all to hear this afternoon. Now, when we were playing dodgeball in school, and some of you might know this, who got picked last? Me. I didn't actually get picked last. I was always like second to last because there's always that kid who got the exemption from his mother who didn't want to play, and so he's the real last one. So I felt good. I wasn't totally last, but I was second to last. And you know, I won't tear up, which I've gone through a lot of therapy to get over that. But listen, I was angry as a kid. Of course, choose me. Now I look back on it and go, why would they have chosen you, big head? You're a liability. I couldn't run, I couldn't jump, I couldn't catch, and actually you could probably hit my head with a ball from Mars. I was a moving target. I was the runt. Don't pick me. Dodgeball, like a kingdom, is all about survival. And you do not pick David to be your king. You pick the older, more established, stronger. But God says, no. That's not the way my kingdom works. You pick based on looks, but I see what is essential, into the heart. And you see this as a pattern. God's done it time and time again, and you need to see this pattern developing. He chooses Hannah. He chooses Moses, not Aaron. Aaron was about 3 years older. He chooses Joseph over his older brothers. He chooses Jacob over Esau. Time and time again, it's the younger over the older, the ugly over the more beautiful. The younger over the older. It's a way of God saying this. The way the world works is to prioritize people according to their advantage, according to their skill. But I'll pick the runt of the litter to lead my people. And he was chosen by grace. Look back at the story really quickly before I move on. Do you notice that it doesn't say why David was chosen? It doesn't say that he was holier than his brothers. It doesn't say that he was more obedient than his brothers. It doesn't say any reason, any rationale for why he was chosen and not his brothers as a way to say this. It's grace, grace, and grace, and grace alone. God says, you choose who you want. I choose who I want. Learn to live in my kingdom where the values are flipped on their head. The weak are made strong. The poor are made rich. The runt of the litter is chosen to lead the pack. That makes me feel a whole lot better about having that big head at school. The runt of the litter's chosen. This is the way God has worked through the Bible. This is the way he continues to work. And it's by grace. And another point of by grace is that at the end of the story, it says that the Holy Spirit rushed onto David as a way to say this. David couldn't be king without the Spirit. And you know this because much later he's going to screw up. And God's going to forgive him. And it's only by the Spirit and it's only by grace that God says, I choose him. I'm not going to give you a reason. He's not just more holy than everybody else. He doesn't go to church more than everybody else. But I choose him. I am, God says, that I am. You don't place rules on me. You choose the older, I'll take the runt. And he'll be the one who leads you. Now, really quickly, I have to touch on something because if you read the text, you have a point of contention because you say, look, wait a second. It says that David was handsome, right? Notice, it says this. It says David came in. And actually, it's really cool Hebrew word. It means like ruddy. It means like he was like the brawny man when he came in. He was ruddy, right? He was out taking the sheep. You know, he's killing lions. He's like an outdoorsy kind of guy. And he comes in and it says he's handsome. You got to know this. I can't unpack it. Don't have enough time. The word that they use for the appearance of Eliab is not the same Hebrew word as they use for the appearance of David. Actually, the word that they use for the appearance of David is a sort of a Hebrew idiom. And it's used throughout the Bible. In many other cases, we have this about Moses and about a few other people. Esther is one of them. It's a way of saying that God has seen this person, and God has seen fit to make them handsome. See, on the one hand, the people wanted Eliab to be the king because he looked the part. He had all the optics. But God issues this idiom and says, no. You think he's handsome, but I think he's handsome. I see little David, and I see more beauty in him than you ever could imagine. No one saw beauty in David until he walked in the room, and he was going to be the king. It's a way of saying this. I called it an idiom. It's a way of God saying, listen, you judge beauty one way, but I judge beauty a whole other way. I see beauty in weakness. I see beauty in the eighth child. I see beauty in the runt. I see beauty in the forgotten one. I see beauty in the one that everybody else says, go to the fields while we have the party. God says, get them in here. I choose them. But there's another shepherd. Comes from Bethlehem. And if you like the story of David, and if you like the little guy winning, good. If you like the little guy coming out on top in the end, that's a great feel-good story, isn't it? And you go in peace now. Have some coffee and some cake. And it might warm you. And if you're like me and have a scarred childhood with a big head, you might feel better a little bit about yourself, saying, oh, that's okay. God chooses the runts. He can choose me. It'll just be a story. A rather nice story. Until you see God doing it once and for all in one of the most radical, profound ways. Let me explain it this way. Sometime later, somebody else comes from Bethlehem. And Paul writes about him. And Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. And I'm going to paraphrase this because I'm sure some of you have read this many times before. And in chapter 1, Paul says this. He says, listen, people, the Greeks, they want wisdom to lead them. They honor and value wisdom, logic, reason. That's what they look for in their leaders. That's what they look for in their kings. And he says the Jews, on the other hand, they want power. He calls it signs. He says, listen, on the one hand, the Greeks want wisdom, knowledge. That's where they place the value in. That's their optics. But on the other hand, Paul says, the Jews, on the other hand, they don't necessarily crave wisdom in their leaders, but they want power. They want signs and miracles. And Paul says, but we got this dude who doesn't fit any of those. We get the true king, the true runt of the litter, so to speak. The king who was unlike any other king to come. Go back to that story of Saul. And Saul does what you and I do. He does what every other king ever did. He amassed power. He built monuments to himself. He lied to cover up his weaknesses. He wanted to present to everyone around him a perfect image. We saw this last week, did we not? And he would go to great lengths to cover and mask and hide. Why? Because he knew that everyone around him would judge him on the optics, on how he appeared. But in Jesus, you know what you get? You get a king who says, I didn't come to get power. I came to lose it. You think David is a good story because he was out in the wilderness, out in the fields, and they had to bring him on in, and he was dirty and mindful. He was the Cinderella story, come true. There's a greater one. And you gotta know it. For you. You have to know what true beauty looks like. It's on the cross. And Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, says it's going to look like stupidity to everyone. Your king saves you by dying and giving his life. It's ridiculous. Kings come to get power. Jesus says, I come to give it. I'll lose and you'll win. And God says, that's true beauty. Jesus didn't look the part. One time they say, you remember, anything good come out of Nazareth. He didn't fit the role. He wasn't who you would pick to be your king. And God says, you got him. You're welcome. And when you and I start to see that as beauty, it'll start to change the way you and I relate, not only to our own hearts, but to others as well. You'll start to see beauty where nobody else sees it. You'll see beauty in the runts. You'll see beauty in the ones who are cast out. You'll see beauty in the marginalized and the weak and the poor, because you see a God who finds the beauty in them. He says, I see David and I see beauty, but I see Jesus and I see true beauty. God says, you see with the eyes, I see the heart. And if you come to Jesus and you say, now I know that he lost it all as the true king for me, it will start to invert your value system. You will start to see beauty in the ashes, glory on the cross, true beauty in the weak and the minor in your life, the people everyone else looks down on. And maybe you're one of those people, and maybe you've been the runt of the litter, and maybe you felt hopeless and outcast and that nobody values you. Do you see now that God says, no, I'm working through you. I've always done it this way. I will always do it this way. And Jesus is that way. It'll change what you call beautiful. Let me explain this by this as I close. I have a rather favorite book, and if you've come to Soul Grace, you've heard me quote this book multiple times. And as I do it, I always have to give a little bit of an explanation for this book, because it's a rather difficult book to understand if you haven't read it. And I realize that of all the times that I've quoted this particular book by C.S. Lewis, I've never quoted this part. And it's a part that I was rereading in reflecting on what beauty looks like in my eyes versus God's eyes. What true glory looks like in my eyes versus God's. How to judge somebody in my eyes versus his. And here's the story. It comes in the book, The Great Divorce. One of my favorites, and you know this, I've mentioned this many times. And C.S. Lewis, what he does in The Great Divorce, it's an allegory, where he has people come up from hell at the foothills of heaven, and he has these angels come down, and they know each other from their life on earth, and they're trying to convince the person who is in hell to come to heaven, to accept grace, to just accept it. And the people, they're called shadows. The people who came from hell come up with every excuse time and time again. They'll say, I'll go if I'm valuable there. And the angels say, you're not, but you're loved. And they say, I'll go if so-and-so isn't there, because they don't deserve to be there, I do. And the angels say, no one deserves to be here. Come, take grace. And the narrator of the story, he's watching all these different encounters happen. And what C.S. Lewis, he's trying to communicate is the heart of people. Why some people refuse heaven. Why some people say, no, I opt for hell. An endless autobiography of myself. But he has this one great part towards the end. It's easy to miss. The narrator has a teacher, and they're walking through this wood, and they're seeing these various encounters, and all of a sudden, the narrator says, he hears a noise unlike anything he's ever heard. He hears birds singing. He hears the trees moving and whispering. And he hears something so sweet that he can't even put words to it. And here's what he says: boys and girls surrounding this one woman, singing. And he says, if I could remember their singing and write down the notes, no man who read that score would ever grow sick or old, and only partly do I remember the unbearable beauty of her face. And he turns to his guide, and he says, is it? Is she? And the guide interrupts her and says, not at all. It's someone you will have never heard of. Her name on earth was Sarah Smith, and she lived at Golders Green. And then the narrator interrupts him and he says, well, she seems, at least to me, to be a person of rather particular importance. She has boys and girls surrounding her. All these animals are surrounding and singing her praises. And she's walking with all of them. And the teacher says, she is one of the great ones. But you have heard that fame in this country and fame on earth are two quite different things. And the narrator says, but then who are all these men and women who are singing around her, these young boys, young women on each side? And the narrator, his teacher, says, they are her sons and daughters. For every young man and every young woman that she met became her son and her daughter. Even if it was only the little boy who brought meat to her back door. All of them fell in love with her. And he says, every beast and every bird that came near her became the true beast and the bird because they saw her beauty. And he says, you have never heard from her on earth. She was not famous, But fame here is entirely different than fame there. And he says, yes, it's like when you throw a stone into a pool and the concentric waves spread out further and further, meaning the influence you can have. Who knows where it'll end? The teacher finishes by saying, redeemed humanity is still young. It has hardly come to its full strength. But already, there's joy enough in the little finger of a great saint such as that woman to waken all the dead things in the universe into life. What he says is beauty, as you see it, is radically different than the way God sees it. And God says, do you want to know true beauty? It's on the King who would die for you. See his scars as beautiful. See his weakness as strength. See his loss as your gain. And here's what it'll do, and I'll apply this as I quickly close. It should do a couple things for you. First, as I said, maybe you've been the runt of the litter of your life. Maybe you've been the outcast. Maybe you've been the one not invited to the party. Do you see now that God, probably through you more than others, is working? And that should be some sort of encouragement. Jesus is the proof of that. But more than that, here's what it should do for you and me as Christians. If we believe that the true king was the humble king, then it makes us look at everyone else in our life differently. We see everyone not from their externals, not from what they can offer, not because they're polished, not because they're well off or well-to-do. We find beauty in the ashes. We see the Cinderella, and we say, come, wear the slipper. We see the David, come, be king. We see Jesus, come, die, rule, and save them all. This is not coincidentally enough why most people believe that at this time of the anointing, David wrote Psalm 139. If you ever go back to that, I won't read it all, but read Psalm 139. What David says is in there, he says, you come before me, you go behind me, God. You know me. Before I was born, before I spoke a word, you knew every dirty, dark detail. He says, you hem me in from behind and before. And there's a part in there in Psalm 139 where he says, you saw my unformed nature. You know what that means? David knows grace. He says, God, you've seen me in the morning before I put on the makeup, before I take the shower, before I put on my suit. You've seen me my rawest. You've seen me my weakest. And yet you choose me? If you can go to God and say, you've seen me in my unformed nature, and you chose me, it'll radically change the way you relate to your own heart and to everyone else. There's that part in The Little Prince, you remember the story, where he's all sad because he has this rose and he thinks it's the most special thing in the world and he thinks it's the only rose that's ever there. And then he sees a rose bush and the little prince, he's so sad. And remember what the fox says to him. Fox says, I'll tell you a secret. You want to know the secret to life? And the fox says, you know what's so special about that rose? Yes, it's one of many, but it's not. It's unique because you love it uniquely. And the fox says, here's my secret. It's only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. What he's saying is, little prince, you look at that rose and you see it like nobody else sees it. So it's not like any other rose on a bush. It's yours. And you'll go to the ends of the earth to claim it, to save it. Know that God did that for you. You are uniquely beautiful because Christ was uniquely beautiful for you. Go and pray on that. Meditate on that. That's the good news for you today.